The desert floor is pitch black. It is 200 a.m. Inside the steel hull of a Soviet-built T-72 tank, the crew is waiting. They feel safe. They are surrounded by a battalion of tanks and protected by a dense wall of Shilka anti-aircraft guns. Their commanders have told them that nothing can get close to them without being shredded. Suddenly, 3 miles away, a pair of eyes opens in the dark. These aren't human eyes. They are thermal sensors. They turn the pitch-black night into a glowing green video game. A laser beam, invisible to the naked eye, silently paints the hull of the lead tank. There is no warning siren, no radar lock, no roar of jet engines, just a flash of white light. In an instant, the 40-ton tank is ripped apart. The turret is thrown into the air. Before the echo of the explosion even rolls across the dunes, a second tank explodes, then a third. Panic erupts. The anti-aircraft gunners spin their turrets wildly, searching the sky for a target. But their radar screens are empty. They fire thousands of rounds into the darkness, hitting nothing but air. They are fighting a ghost that is hovering just below the tree line, completely silent, picking them off one by one. This was not an airstrike. It was an execution. And the executioner was a machine that the Soviet Union had laughed at for a decade. A machine they swore was too slow, too ugly, and too fragile to survive on a modern battlefield. They called it a toy. The Americans called it the AH-64 Apache. To understand how this massacre happened and why the Soviet generals got it so fatally wrong, we have to go back to the beginning. Back to the moment when the Kremlin looked at this machine and decided it was a joke. It was the early 1980s. In the cold gray lecture halls of the Voroshilov General Staff Academy in Moscow, the mood was one of supreme confidence. This was where the finest minds of the Soviet military were trained. And when they looked at the concept of the attack helicopter, they saw a dead end. To the Soviet mind, the helicopter was a useful tool, but it was fundamentally flawed. It was slow. It was loud. It was a soft target. In the brutal calculus of a European war where the sky would be filled with supersonic jets and the ground would be bristling with anti-aircraft guns, a helicopter was nothing more than a victim. They had studied the American experience in Vietnam. They had seen how thousands of Hueys and Cobras had been shot down by simple small arms fire. They had concluded that against the Red Army, the lifespan of an American helicopter would be measured in seconds. So when intelligence reports began to arrive describing the U.S. Army's new Advanced Attack Helicopter program, the reaction in Moscow was not fear. It was derision. To the Soviet generals, the Apache looked ridiculous. It wasn't sleek like a jet. It was an insect. A collection of ugly angles, exposed engines, and a rotor hub that looked like it was made of clockwork. It didn't have the heavy bathtub-like titanium armor of their own Mi-24 Hind. It looked flimsy. They are building a glass cannon, a Soviet air defense specialist might have scoffed. Look at it. It is open. It is exposed. One burst from a ZSU-23, and it will fall out of the sky like a stone. The ZSU-23 for Shilka. This was the reason for their confidence. The Shilka was a terrifying weapon. It was a 4-barreled radar-guided anti-aircraft tank that could spew 4,000 rounds of explosive shells per minute. It was designed specifically to protect Soviet tank columns from low-flying aircraft. The Soviet doctrine was simple, the umbrella. Every Soviet tank regiment moved under a dense, overlapping umbrella of anti-aircraft fire. They believed they had created a no-fly zone directly above their army. They imagined the American Apaches trying to fly over the battlefield, just like they did in Vietnam. They imagined them popping up to fire rockets, exposing themselves to the radar of the Shilkas. In their war games, the result was always the same. The American helicopters would be detected. The Shilkas would turn their turrets. A wall of lead would fill the sky. The helicopters would burn. The Soviet generals laughed because they believed the Americans were wasting billions of dollars on a suicide machine. They believed the era of the helicopter was over before it had even begun. They were preparing for the last war. They were preparing for Vietnam Redux. They had no idea that the Americans had already realized the exact same thing. In the Pentagon, the U.S. Army planners were not stupid. They knew exactly what a ZSU-23 could do. They knew that if they flew an Apache over a Soviet tank column, it would be suicide. They looked at the problem: 50,000 Warsaw-packed tanks poised to roll across the North German plain. A tsunami of steel that NATO could not stop with tanks alone. They needed a way to kill tanks by the thousands. They needed a force multiplier. But they couldn't use jets. The weather in Europe was too bad. They had to use helicopters. But they had to reinvent how a helicopter fought. The Apache was not designed to be a flying tank like the Soviet Hind. It was not designed to brawl. It was designed to be a sniper. The Soviet mistake, the arrogant assumption that cost them everything, was assuming that the Apache would fight fair, that it would come out in the open. They didn't understand the concept of nap of the earth. The Apache was built with a very specific, terrifying philosophy. It was designed to live in the mud. It was designed to fly at treetop level, literally skimming the grass, hiding behind hills, hiding behind forests, hiding in riverbeds. While the Soviet Shilka radars were scanning the sky looking for targets at 500 feet, the Apache would be hovering at 10 feet, completely invisible, masked by the terrain. But hiding was only half the equation. To be a killer, you had to shoot. The Soviets assumed that to fire the helicopter had to pop up, expose itself, aim, and shoot. This took time. Time enough for a Shilka to lock on. So the Americans gave the Apache a secret weapon. A weapon that changed the geometry of the battlefield. The AGM-114 Hellfire missile. The Soviets knew about anti-tank missiles. They had them too. But the Hellfire was different. It was laser-guided. And it had a range of 8 kilometers, 5 miles. This was the critical number, the magic number. The effective range of a Soviet ZSU-23 for Shilka was about 2.5 kilometers. The effective range of their SA-8 missiles was about 6 kilometers. The Hellfire could kill from 8. This meant the Apache could hover behind a tree line 5 miles away from the Soviet tank column, completely invisible to radar and the naked eye. It could launch a missile that would arc high into the air and plunge down onto the thin top armor of a T-72. The Soviet tank commander would explode without ever seeing the helicopter that killed him. He wouldn't even hear the rotor blades. He would just die. But the Soviets didn't know this. Or rather, they chose to ignore it. They looked at the flimsy airframe and saw weakness. They didn't see the lethal geometry. And there was one more thing they laughed at. The electronics. Just like with the M1 Abrams, the Soviets looked at the nose of the Apache stuffed with cameras, sensors, and computers and saw fragility. It is too complex, they said. It will break in the field. It requires too much maintenance. A rugged soldier needs a rugged weapon. The Apache's nose carried the TADS PNVS system, Target Acquisition and Designation Site. It looked like a strange, rotating, robotic eye. And inside that eye was the same revolutionary technology that made the Abrams invincible thermal imaging. The Soviets were preparing for a war fought with eyes and spotlights. They assumed that at night, or in bad weather, or in battlefield smoke, the helicopters would be grounded. The Apache was designed to own the night. The FLIR sensor could turn the darkest night into a crisp, green-glowing video game. It could see the heat of a tank engine from miles away. It could see through the smoke of the battlefield. While the Soviet tankers were blind, buttoned up in their steel coffins, waiting for dawn, the Apache pilots could see every rivet on their hulls. This was the fragile toy the Soviets mocked. A machine that could hide in the grass, shoot from beyond the horizon, and see in the dark. But arrogance is a powerful blinder. The Soviet military machine was a heavy, slow-moving beast. It had momentum. It had doctrine. It had manuals written in blood. It was not easy to change the mind of a Soviet marshal. They continued to build thousands of tanks. They continued to build thousands of Shilkas. They continued to train their troops to watch the sky for silhouettes. They were building a Maginot Line in the sky, and the Americans were building the machine that would simply fly under it. The stage was set for a confrontation. But it wouldn't happen in Germany. It wouldn't happen in the Fulda Gap. It would happen in a place where there were no trees to hide behind. A place where the environment was even more hostile than the winter of Europe. The desert. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, he possessed one of the largest tank armies in the world. His Republican Guard was equipped with T-72s and protected by a dense Soviet-style air defense network. His advisors trained in Moscow told him he was safe. "The Americans cannot use their helicopters here," they told him. "The desert is flat. There is no cover. If an Apache tries to approach, we will see it from 20 kilometers away. Our Shilkas will eat them alive. The sand will destroy their delicate turbine engines. The heat will fry their computers." It was a reasonable assumption, on paper. Saddam's generals, echoing their Soviet mentors, believed that the desert was a tank country. They believed that any air attack would have to come from high-altitude jets. They were ready for jets. They were not ready for the swarm that was gathering just across the border in Saudi Arabia. Hundreds of AH-64 Apaches were being unloaded from C-5 Galaxy transport planes. Crews were working around the clock, fitting sand filters to the engines, calibrating the lasers, loading thousands of Hellfire missiles. The pilots were nervous. They knew the Soviet doctrine. They knew the capabilities of the Shilka. They knew that if the standoff theory was wrong, if the thermal sights couldn't cut through the desert heat shimmer, they were going to die. But they also knew something the Iraqis didn't. They knew that the Apache wasn't just a helicopter. It was a predator, and it was hungry. The laughter in the Soviet briefing rooms was about to be silenced forever. The fragile toy was winding up its rotors, and the first shots of the war, the shots that would blind an entire nation, would not be fired by a stealth fighter or a cruise missile or a battleship. They would be fired by the Apache. In the darkness of January 17, 1991, a group of Apaches flying under the call sign, Task Force Normandy, lifted off into the moonless sky. Their mission was suicidal by Soviet standards. They were flying deep into enemy territory, flying so low their wheels almost touched the sand dunes to destroy the massive early warning radar sites that guarded the Iraqi border. They were the tip of the spear. If they failed, the entire air war would be compromised. If they were spotted, they would be shredded. The Soviet generals would have bet everything that they would fail. They were about to lose that bet. The desert floor was speeding by at 100 miles per hour, just 20 feet below the landing gear. It was 2:30 a.m. on January 17th. Task Force Normandy was deep inside Iraq. The group consisted of 8 AH-64 Apaches and 4 MH-53 PAVE-low helicopters. They were flying in total radio silence, lights out, navigating solely by the ghostly green glow of their night vision goggles. Their target was a pair of massive Soviet-made spoon rest and flat-face early warning radars. These radars were the eyes of the western sector of the Iraqi air defense. If they remained operational, the hundreds of American jets launching in less than 30 minutes would be detected and slaughtered. The Apaches had to poke out the eyes. The Soviet advisors had assured the Iraqis that these radar sites were safe. They were located deep behind the lines. They were protected by anti-aircraft guns. And most importantly, two armed aircraft could approach them without being seen by the radar itself. But the Soviets had forgotten the curvature of the Earth. The Apaches were flying so low that they were literally underneath the radar beams. They were invisible not because of stealth coding, but because of geometry. At 2:37 a.m., the lead Apache pilot saw the radar dish glowing on his thermal display. It was rotating rhythmically, searching the sky for threats that were not there. The pilot whispered a single code word into his radio. "Party in 10 seconds. The Apaches popped up. They unmasked from behind the sand dunes. For the first time, they exposed themselves to the enemy sensors. But it was too late for the Iraqis to react. From a range of 4 kilometers well outside the reach of the anti-aircraft guns defending the site, the Apaches unleashed hell. Hellfire missiles roared off the rails. Hydra rockets screamed through the air. The 30mm chain guns slaved to the pilot's helmet movements began to chatter. In less than 60 seconds, the radar site was erased. The massive dishes were turned into twisted, burning metal. The bunkers were collapsed. The generator trucks exploded. The eyes of Western Iraq went blind. The Apache commander keyed his mic. California, away. It was the code word for success. Minutes later, the roar of jet engines filled the sky above them. Hundreds of F-15s and F-111s streamed through the hole the Apaches had just kicked in the door. The air war had begun. But for the Apache, this was just the opening act. The raid on the radar site was a special operation. The real test, the confrontation that would decide the fate of the Soviet Doctrine, was yet to come. The ground war. A month later, in late February, the Allied ground offensive began. And this was where the Soviet generals expected their T-72s to finally shine. They believed that once the war moved to the mud and the sand, the fragile American helicopters would be useless. The battlefield would be filled with smoke dust and chaos. The Shilkas would finally have targets they could see. They were wrong. The battlefield conditions didn't blind the Apache. They blinded its prey. The slaughter began on the highway of death, and it spread to the engagement zones of the Republican Guard. The tactic the Americans used was something the Soviets had no answer for. It was called deep attack. Instead of waiting for the tanks to come to them, the Apaches went hunting. They flew 30, 40, even 50 miles ahead of the American ground forces. They flew at night, in the worst weather, when the Iraqi crews were exhausted and buttoned up inside their tanks. Imagine the perspective of an Iraqi tank commander in the Medina division. He is sitting in his T-72. It is raining. The visibility is terrible. He has his radar-guided Shilkas scanning the sectors. He feels secure in the mass of his formation. He has 50 tanks around him. He expects to see the enemy. He expects a muzzle flash from an American tank or the whine of a jet engine. He sees nothing. 5 miles away, hovering silently behind a ridgeline, an Apache pilot is looking at him. On the pilot's thermal display, the T-72 is not a dark shape in the rain. It is a glowing white brick. The heat from its massive diesel engine, even though it is idling, makes it shine like a lighthouse beacon against the cold desert background. The pilot doesn't even have to point the nose of the helicopter at the tank. He just looks at it. His helmet sensor tracks his eye movement. The chain gun under the nose swivels to match his gaze. But for a tank, he uses the heavy hitter, rifle. A Hellfire missile drops from the rail. Its rocket motor ignites. It accelerates to Mach 1.3. The Soviet doctrine relied on the idea that a missile launch would be detected. The flash of the motor, the smoke trail. But the Apache is 5 miles away. The Iraqi commander can't see the flash. He can't hear the launch. The Hellfire climbs. It doesn't fly in a straight line. It arcs high into the sky, climbing to 2,000 feet, looking for the laser spot that the Apache gunner is holding on the T-72. Then it dives. The T-72 has thick frontal armor. It is designed to survive a hit from another tank. But its top armor, the roof of the turret, is thin. The Hellfire strikes the tank from directly above. A shaped charge warhead blasts a jet of molten copper through the roof. It ignites the ammunition stored in the autoloader. The T-72 explodes. From the perspective of the other Iraqi crews, their comrade just vanished. One moment he was there, the next moment a fireball. Panic sets in. The radio net fills with screaming. Where is it coming from? Where are they? The Shilkas spin their turrets. They fire blindly into the rain. They launch flares, but the Apache is already gone. The pilot has fired, dropped back behind the ridgeline, and moved to a new position. Shoot and scoot. The Soviet generals had laughed at the Apache's lack of armor. They said it couldn't take a hit. The American response was simple. You can't hit what you can't see. Night after night, battalion after battalion of Soviet-made armor was disassembled by invisible snipers. The psychological impact was devastating. Iraqi crews began to abandon their tanks at the first sound of a rotor blade. The T-72, the pride of the Soviet export market, became a metal coffin. The fragile toy was eating the iron fist alive. One specific engagement highlights the total dominance of this new philosophy. It happened near the Kuwaiti border. A single battalion of Apaches engaged a brigade of the Republican Guard. In the span of 45 minutes, the helicopters destroyed 50 tanks, dozens of armored personnel carriers, and terrified the remaining infantry into surrendering to a drone. Not a single Apache was shot down. The Shilkas, the ZSU-23s that were supposed to shred the helicopters, were usually the first targets to die. The Apache pilots prioritized them. They would pick off the air defense units from extreme range with Hellfires stripping the umbrella away, and then move in with rockets and guns to finish off the defenseless tanks. This was the ultimate humiliation for the Soviet military advisors watching from Moscow. Their entire doctrine was based on combined arms, the idea that tanks, infantry, and anti-aircraft guns would protect each other. The Apache unraveled this fabric. It peeled the layers apart. It proved that a high-tech, expensive, fragile sensor platform could defeat a mass-produced, rugged, dumb army. The Soviet generals had calculated the war based on the weight of steel. They counted the number of gun barrels. They counted the thickness of armor plate. They failed to count the number of microchips. The Apache's victory was not about firepower. The T-72 had a bigger gun. The Shilka threw more bullets. The Apache's victory was about information. The Apache pilot knew where the enemy was. The enemy did not know where the Apache was. In the modern age, that is the only advantage that matters. By the time the ceasefire was declared, hundreds of Iraqi tanks lay burning in the desert, destroyed by helicopters. The myth of the glass cannon was shattered. The Apache had proven itself to be the deadliest tank killer in history. But the story doesn't end in the desert. The humiliation of the T-72 had a profound effect on the future of warfare. The Soviets and later the Russians realized that their concept of mass was dead. You could not simply flood the battlefield with cheap tanks and expect to win. They began to desperately try to copy the American success. They started upgrading their own attack helicopters, the Mi-28 Havoc, and the K-50, trying to give them the same night vision capabilities and long-range missiles as the Apache. They realized that the laughter in the briefing room in 1980 had been the laughter of dinosaurs watching the meteor coming. The Apache was the meteor, and there was one final twist of irony. The Soviet generals had criticized the Apache for being too complex and too hard to maintain. They predicted it would break down in the sand. During Desert Storm, the Apache fleet maintained a mission readiness rate of over 85%. The complex, high-tech American machines kept flying. Meanwhile, the rugged, simple Soviet tanks were breaking down, running out of fuel, or sitting abandoned because their crews were too terrified to turn the engines on. The fragile toy had outlasted the rugged beast. As the smoke cleared over the highway of death, the world saw the truth. The era of the tank charge was over. The era of the vertical flank death from above in the dark had arrived. The Apache had rewritten the rules of war. And it had done so by turning the Soviet Union's greatest strength, its mass, into its greatest weakness, a target-rich environment. As the smoke cleared over the burning oil fields of Kuwait, military analysts from around the world descended on the battlefield. They were there to conduct the autopsy of the Iraqi army. What they found in the sand was a graveyard of Soviet military philosophy. They walked past rows of T-72 tanks that had been ripped open like tin cans. They inspected the charred remains of BMP personnel carriers. And most tellingly, they looked at the wreckage of the ZSU-23 Shilkas. The Shilka was supposed to be the predator. It was supposed to be the machine that cleared the skies. Instead, the analysts found Shilkas with their radar dishes stowed in the travel position, destroyed before they could even turn their systems on. Others had their turrets pointed in the wrong direction, firing wildly at a phantom sound, while the missile that killed them came from the opposite horizon. The umbrella of air defense had not leaked. It had been shredded. The final statistics of the Apache's performance in the Gulf War were not just a victory. They were a statistical anomaly. In just 100 hours of ground combat, the AH-64 Apache fleet was credited with destroying over 500 main battle tanks. They destroyed hundreds of armored personnel carriers, artillery pieces, and trucks. And what was the cost? The Soviet generals had predicted that the fragile helicopters would fall from the sky in droves. They expected hundreds of losses. In reality, only one Apache was lost to enemy fire during the actual ground war. 1. The crew survived. The glass cannon had proven to be made of Kevlar and titanium. There were instances where Apaches returned to base riddled with bullet holes from small arms fire. The Soviet AK-47s and heavy machine guns had hit them. But the Apache was designed with redundant systems. If one engine was shot out, it flew on the other. If the hydraulics were severed, there was a backup. The bathtub around the pilots held firm. The Soviets had confused ugliness with weakness. They had looked at the exposed engines and the complex rotor hub and assumed they were vulnerable. They didn't understand that American engineering had focused on survivability just as much as lethality. But the true measure of the Apache's dominance was not in the hardware destroyed. It was in the mines broken. By the third day of the ground war, a strange phenomenon began to occur. Iraqi tank crews, veterans of a decade of war, stopped fighting. When they heard the distant rhythmic thumping of rotor blades in the dark, they didn't man their guns. They didn't try to scan for targets. They jumped out of their tanks and ran. They knew that being inside a T-72 when an Apache was hunting was a death sentence. The tank, once the symbol of their power, had become a trap, a magnet for Hellfire missiles. There were reports of entire Iraqi companies surrendering to a single hovering helicopter, men waving white flags at a machine hovering a mile away. This was the ultimate psychological victory. The Apache had achieved what the Stuka dive bomber had achieved in World War II. It had become a symbol of inevitable destruction. Back in Moscow, the silence in the briefing rooms was deafening. The humiliation was total. The Soviet military-industrial complex had spent 40 years perfecting the tank army. They had built a force designed to overwhelm NATO with mass and speed. The Apache had rendered that entire investment obsolete. What good is a 50-ton tank if it can be destroyed by a flying robot from 5 miles away in the dark? What good is a deep battle doctrine if your supply trucks and command vehicles are incinerated before they even reach the front line? The Apache proved that the close fight, the brutal close-range brawl that the Soviets excelled at, was a thing of the past. The Americans had stretched the battlefield. They had turned war into a long-range shooting gallery. This realization had profound consequences. It effectively ended the Soviet dream of a conventional conquest of Europe. If the export-grade T-72s in Iraq could be slaughtered so easily, what chance did the T-80s in East Germany really have? If the Shilkas couldn't stop the Apache in the flat open desert, how could they possibly stop it in the forests and hills of Bavaria, where there was infinite cover? The math didn't work anymore. The Soviet generals realized that to stop the Apache, they would need a completely new generation of weapons. They needed missiles that could see over hills. They needed radars that could ignore ground clutter. But in 1991, the Soviet Union was bankrupt. They didn't have the money to invent these new weapons. They barely had the money to pay their soldiers. The laughter from 1980 had turned into a funeral dirge. The legacy of the AH-64 Apache goes far beyond the burning wrecks of the Gulf War. It fundamentally changed the way nations think about air power. Before the Apache, the attack helicopter was seen as a supporting actor, a useful but vulnerable addition to the Army. After the Apache, the attack helicopter became the queen of the chessboard. It proved that a battle of sensors beats a battle of armor every time. The Apache won not because it had a bigger gun, but because it had a better eye. The TAD-ES PNVS sensor suite was the real weapon. The Hellfire missile was just the courier. The Soviets had focused on the arrow, the speed of the missile, the thickness of the armor. The Americans had focused on the archer, the ability to see to target and to decide. This philosophical gap is what killed the T-72. The Soviet tank was a blind giant flailing in the dark. The American helicopter was a surgical instrument guided by the light of 1,000 microchips. In the years following the war, the Russian military desperately tried to catch up. They accelerated the development of their own attack helicopters, the Mi-28 Night Hunter and the Ka-52 Alligator. You can see the influence of the Apache in their designs. They added thermal cameras. They added long-range missiles. They copied the tactics of Nap of the Earth flying. They were paying the Apache the ultimate compliment, imitation. But they were decades late. While Russia was trying to build a copy of the 1991 Apache, the Americans were already upgrading it. They added the longbow radar, a mushroom-shaped sensor on top of the rotor mast that allowed the Apache to track 128 targets simultaneously in rain fog or smoke without even using its laser. They turned the sniper into a machine gunner. Today, the AH-64 Apache remains the most feared attack helicopter in the world. It has served in Afghanistan, in Iraq again, and in conflicts around the globe. It has evolved. It can now control drones. It can talk to satellites. But its spirit remains the same. It is still the fragile toy that the generals laughed at. And that laughter serves as a permanent warning to any military power that believes mass is a substitute for innovation. History is littered with the wreckage of armies that believed they were invincible because they were big. The Persians, the French at Agincourt, the battleships at Pearl Harbor, and the tank armies of the Soviet Union, they all fell because they failed to see the future coming. They looked at the new technology, the longbow, the aircraft carrier, the attack helicopter, and they saw weakness. They saw something that didn't fit their understanding of war. So they laughed. The Soviet generals laughed at the Apache because it didn't look like a tank. It didn't fight like a tank. They were right. It wasn't a tank. It was a tank killer. And on those cold desert nights in 1991, as the T-72 turrets spun helplessly in the dark, searching for an enemy they would never see, the Soviet Union learned the final brutal lesson of the Cold War. In the game of technology, he who laughs last usually doesn't live to laugh at all. The nightmare was real, the ghost was real, and the Apache owns the night.